Are supersets especially muscle growth promoting, or are they just another cool tool in the toolbox that you could use in certain contexts? Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for RP Strength, and today I am joined by the illustrious, magnanimous, is that a word? Probably, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. There are lots of experts on muscle hypertrophy, but there is only one the best, and that's Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Brad, did you know that the first the first review of the literature I've ever read on all around approaches to training for optimizing muscular hypertrophy was what I believe was a part of your doctoral dissertation or your master's thesis?
Master's capstone project.
Yep. And it was also, I believe, the first review ever conducted on overall strategies to maximize muscle hypertrophy in the scientific literature.
No, there actually had been a few before, but I think it put things in a context. That now, by the way, is called The Mechanisms of Muscle Hypertrophy and Their Application to Resistance Training. That paper is now the most viewed paper in the history of the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research and has close to 2,000 or maybe more citations.
Unreal. It was a landmark paper. And also, yes, I'm familiar with the older stuff, but it wasn't really a global approach.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It had a certain cachet to it because it looked at mechanisms and tried to tie the mechanisms to how you might prescribe training approaches.
Yes. All right. That was one hell of an intro. Now to supersets. First question. What is a superset? Is it a set that's better than all the other sets and wears an S and flies around?
The simple answer is it's two exercises performed in succession with minimal rest, as short rest as possible between the sets.
I know a couple of different types of supersets. I'm going to list them to you. Let me know if I missed anything. Mm-hmm. There are agonist supersets. So for example, I do cable pushdowns, then I do dumbbell presses. Both hit the triceps to some capacity. So it's triceps, then triceps. Then there are antagonist supersets, where you do tricep pushdowns and then you run over and do bicep curls. One muscle opposes the other. There are also, you could technically say, unrelated muscle supersets, where you do a set of leg extensions on the quads and then you do a set of bicep curls. Are there any other kind of supersets I'm missing in that?
No, you hit the main ones. So from a semantical standpoint, the one is called an agonist-antagonist. This is from the literature. So like a bicep curl into a tricep press down would be an agonist-antagonist superset. What you call the agonist superset is generally called a compound superset, where it's two of the same, basically working on the same muscle group. So that also can be used as a pre-exhaust a lot of times. So you do like a fly into a press, but it doesn't have to be. You could do technically, you could do an incline press and a flat press.
Sure.
And then you have your unrelated, so you can have like a squat into a bicep curl or whatever.
Excellent. My next question to you is, are supersets especially muscle growth promoting, or are they just another cool tool in the toolbox that you could use in certain contexts? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, they're not, well, generally speaking, when you talk about are they muscle promoting, the evidence that we have now does not show they are superior for hypertrophy. We only have a couple of studies on some of the different types, with one exception, which I'll mention shortly. But they're much more efficient ways to train. So here's what I would say. They do not, generally the literature does not show a negative effect of supersets on hypertrophy. So they promote similar hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. And they do it in much less time. Now, there's one study did look at a compound, a quote-unquote pre-exhaust superset, and did show better results for the pre-exhaust, but that has not been replicated in another study. There's only been a couple of studies on the compound, a couple of studies on the agonist-antagonist. I don't recall any on the unrelated. Give you a scoop here. So the agonist-antagonist, there were two studies in the past, both of them untrained subjects. We just finished, I'll give a shout out to Ryan Burke, my master's student, was part of his thesis, one of your former students.
Great student.
Really terrific student. And we looked at two groups. One did agonist-antagonist supersets, and we did 6 different exercises. We did a chest press and a lat pull down. a bicep curl, tricep press down, and a leg extension, leg curl. Now, I will say we don't have, unfortunately, we've not finished the statistical analysis of it. So we should get that shortly. But I think some interesting findings here that I can present that we do have information on. One is that the superset itself, the superset technique versus the non-superset, the vast majority of subjects got nauseous, particularly in the early phases of training, whereas some of the non-superset group did as well, but much, much less, like half the amount got nauseous. And in some of the subjects it persisted. More of the subjects puked in the superset group versus the non-superset group. But again, it was more early phase. Over time, that did not replicate. And interestingly, we did an acute session, looked at the RPE. It was higher in the superset, but when we looked at it across the length of the study, the RPE kind of evened out. So what it shows is if you keep doing supersets, the body seems to adjust to it.
So if you try them and you're like, dude, this is way too hard, keep cracking at it because you'll get used to it.
That's correct. And another caveat to this is that we had all sets to failure. You don't necessarily need to train the failure on all sets. So you can somewhat mitigate conceivably the negative RPE, the negative perceived exertion, and the potential nausea by stopping a rep or two short of failure and probably getting the same gains.
I'm really glad you said that because a lot of people, when they look at agonist-antagonist supersets, like let's say cable pushdowns to a push-up or something, they for some reason assume that at least the first exercise has to be to failure. And the second, maybe not, but it's totally fine to do that kind of superset, stop 2 reps in reserve on pushdowns and then 2 reps in reserve on pushups. Still get a very good effect.
These, again, are not, there's no rules to these things. So you can make it, we need to look to the literature, which tends to show that going to failure is not obligatory, that you don't need to train to failure, certainly on all sets. Yeah. And that stopping a rep or 2 short of failure is not going to hinder your gains and may actually help with strength.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, can you think of some situations? I know that globally, supersets are not somehow dominant to straight sets or maybe rest pause sets, Maya reps, etc. These are all kind of good tools in the toolbox contextually. Can you think of some good contexts in which supersets, at least in the real world, do have some kind of superiority? I can think of a couple offhand. One is if you really have trouble targeting a muscle and punching a lot of volume into it. You know, some people don't, for whatever bro shit this is worth, they do a couple curls and their biceps blow up, pump, soreness, everything. They connect with, they really feel it. For triceps, do you remember Marcus Rule, bodybuilder from back in the day?
Germany.
He had huge biceps and his triceps were obviously fucking massive, but not as big as his biceps. And he just said, like, I have a really hard time connecting with my triceps. In that case, it makes sense to me that, like, if you're going to do a bunch of push downs and that's it, it's kind of like, yeah, you do push downs, it's fine. But if you do push downs and then get right into close grip benching or something, you can really just target and just beat the shit out of the area. That is something I know works. Are there any other scenarios in which supersets offer to you a notable practical advantage?
I think that's fair. I would also at least put out, we know that volume, there is a dose response, at least up to a certain point, a benefit to higher volumes. If you're going to do high volumes and you're having certain, let's say 2 minutes rest, which generally is what you're looking at for proper rest between sets, your session can take quite a long time. By doing supersets, you can minimize the total time and thus your energy level. Like when you start, boredom can set in or whatever, and people just have to get out. I think from the time efficiency standpoint is really important when it comes to supersets. And I think at the very least, it provides the general public with an option for getting in the volume in a manageable format.
Yes. And maybe this is speculative, of course, but from your study on that you recently conducted showing a great, much more nausea in the superset group, at least at first. Early phase. Is it possible that if we do unrelated muscle supersets for whole body, that we can crunch a ton of volume into a short time, but because we're doing that and because no one muscle is ever limiting, we end up getting a pretty, not good, but decent cardiovascular and health stimulus at the same time? What do you think about that?
Speculative, but I certainly can see that. I do think there is, your whole neuromuscular system is involved when it's not like you're your muscles, your brain can send signals directly just to that. There's total body effects when we're talking about the neuromuscular system. So I think there is, and that conceivably is what is driving the nausea, at least initially, is that the body is just not used to. And by the way, these were trained subjects, so they were used to training. So, but the body's not used to, I guess, directing the neural impulses in that way, conceivably. We don't know mechanistically. So how that all plays out is still, there's so much, Mike, that we don't know, and so much, like, you think that we have all of these things really well studied, and I can come on here and give you very definitive answers with high degrees of confidence. But we're still in the really early phases, particularly when it comes to the manipulation of variables, in really understanding, or at least in having strong conclusions on these topics.
I was going to write an autobiography of my life, and it was going to be titled Strong Conclusions. What do you think about that title? Does that look like New York Times bestseller material to you, or kind of like bottom shelf?
I think very fitting.
Thank you. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, thank you so much for the Superset chat. Anything you want to get out to the public about maybe some misconceptions about supersets or things people ought to know that they don't? Is there anything you see in social media being discussed around the topic of supersets that you're like, damn it, I wish people would know X, Y, Z?
Well, I think to your point, you kind of trumped me with it, but the fact that it's not like a drop set where you train to failure and then you're going to drop. So a lot of people think that it's obligatory that you need to train supersets, that they're a failure technique, kind of a advanced training technique that you use when you're going to failure and you're minimizing, that you can use supersets in however you want, in whatever way you want. And I think the other thing is that I would say this, when it comes to say compound supersets, which is same muscle, you do need to be careful. I think there is a negative, or conceivably a negative effect to, if you're going to do a pre-exhaust, there may be some benefits to that, or at least not be negatives to it. Needs more study. But if you're going to do like a incline press into a decline press, you're probably going to be losing out on your volume load on your second exercise, and it probably is not an effective way to train.
Yeah. What do you think about the idea that if you have something like a closed kinetic chain second compound exercise, that you pre-fatigue the target muscle, but then because that target muscle starts to feel like the limiting factor on that second compound set to your neuromuscular system, it seems in some people, and in a particular kind of exercise in which other muscles can compensate for the target muscle, the other muscles end up taking more of the strain, and actually the superset effect largely disappears. For example, if you do cable pushdowns and then you go into incline close grip dumbbell presses, there's no way your pecs alone can press a dumbbell, because if you just activated your pecs, it would just do this. You have to extend. And if your triceps are pre-exhausted, your triceps will be the thing pushed closer to failure at the end. Your pecs are kind of going to be like, this is easy. Whereas if you take a machine press as that second exercise, cable pushdowns first, machine press second, there are no degrees of freedom. If your triceps are even, let's say, neurologically like inactivated, we like zap the nerves, you can actually press with just your pecs alone. And so when people have pre-fatigued triceps, what ends up happening is we see higher pec activity. I know that's been found in at least one study. Has that been replicated? Do you think that's a concern of what kind of second movement you choose?
Good question. It's not been replicated longitudinally. So, I mean, there is some EMG evidence to your point. I think the issue that I have with that is that this is just anecdotal, but the triceps are going to be more limited in a chest press. If your triceps generally will give out before your pecs will. Your pecs just are a much larger muscle group. So I think regardless of the method, the mode that you're using, whether it's a machine, I think that to me would not be an effective way to go about it. I think the better pre-exhaust would be doing like a fly, either a cable fly or a dumbbell fly, and then a chest press where your pecs are pre-fatigued. And then, because your triceps then aren't going to be limiting, where you would then allow the pecs, you've already somewhat pre-fatigued them, and they're not going to fail before, basically they can fail before your triceps do.
But is there a world in which, let's say for the pecs, we do a bunch of flies, but then we get into a machine press for our second part of the superset, and our triceps end up doing most of the work because your body detects, like, the pecs are tired, do more tricep work, and it ends up being that the triceps get a better stimulus than you would think, and the pecs are more left alone, or is that not a suspicion?
Well, good question. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that, I guess, conceivably would be a possibility. That's why we need to do the research.
So basically the take-home question, or the take-home point here is the principles of supersets are all pretty sound. They're decently well hypothesized at least, but we need considerably more hard data to draw more definitive conclusions that we can really take to the gym with us and actually get some results that we're more confident in.
Yeah, well said.
I love it. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, when you are not literally eye lasering people's muscles bigger, which is your favorite hobby, what is your typical, you do actual direct research. You're in the lab working with subjects. That's what you do.
Well, I mean, mostly I'm mentoring my students. So, I don't, generally I help out doing the ultrasounds and doing some of the assessments, but the actual data collection, my students are basically my lifeline. And I could never, people talk about how I can be so productive. It's having a great team. So I would never be able to do, and a big shout out to my students. They are what fuels me, and they are really my lifeline to research. So
I love it. Dr. Schoenfeld, thank you so much for appearing on the channel. That was really wholesome. I thought he was going to say some controversial shit. It didn't work out. Maybe we'll get him next time. See you guys then.